Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. This episode of the show is being sponsored by the Amazonian Plant Healing Center, the Temple of the Way of Light. The temple offers 12-day retreats, 6 ceremonies, working in the Shipibo lineage of Ayahuasca. You have an opportunity to work with 2 to 3 facilitators, a yoga teacher, a vegetalista, which is kind of like an herbalist, and just really an amazing support staff. And it's a place I've worked at for a number of years. So I was really happy when they agreed to sponsor the show because I can really attest to the integrity of the work that they do. They've been closed since March of 2020, but they're scheduled to reopen in June of 2021. And it's a really amazing place. If you're interested in working with ayahuasca, if you've never worked with ayahuasca and you're looking to do that for the first time, or if you've worked with ayahuasca before and you're looking to go deeper, to explore more, it's really an amazing place with just an amazing support system, amazing people working there. So I would highly recommend it. So for more information, you can check out their website at the templeofthewayoflight.org. And then also myself and my colleague Marav Artsy, who I interviewed, I think about 3 podcasts ago, we'll be running dietas, which is one of the traditional ways that people learn to work with plants through a prolonged period of isolation, of fasting, of ingesting particular plants, usually trees, and then also mixed with tobacco, which was the lineage that we were trained in. So that's a really amazing opportunity to really go deeper into this work, to learn on a more experiential level. And whether someone has worked with plants before, the opportunity to really open that world, or if someone has worked with plants before, to deepen that connection. So we'll be running a diet in the Sacred Valley of Peru in Urubamba. The first one we have scheduled, I believe, is March 3rd to the 19th, and then we have another one scheduled May 1st to the 17th. And to find out more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org or Marav's site at tobaccodiets.com. And all of those sites will be in the show notes. So that's it for that. In this episode, I had a chance and an opportunity to interview the great Dennis McKenna. Many of you are probably familiar with him, or you've heard his name. He's really one of the pioneers of this work, one of the guys who really started doing this work a number of years ago. He and his brother, Terrence McKenna, who's very well known also, really began to open this work up to a larger audience, to a bigger public, to really shed some light on these plants, ayahuasca, yopo, mushrooms. And so it was really a pleasure to be able to have the opportunity to speak to Dennis. I know him through mutual friends. And I think voices like his are just really important. Hopefully for all of us as we get older, there's some wisdom that comes with that age. And he's seen a lot in his life. He's gone through a lot. He's done a tremendous amount of work. He's an ethnopharmacologist, and he's really done a lot of writing, and really been I think a really good ambassador in bridging the world of this plant medicine to the broader world at large. So we got in some interesting topics, and I hope you enjoy this episode. As always, if you're able to help to support this episode through donation, that's greatly appreciated. Really helps me to be able to interview these people like Dennis, to create new podcasts, to bring you new content. A really good way of doing that is through Patreon. It's a subscription service where you can pledge a few dollars a month, and you get different benefits with each of those different tiers. So it's a really nice way to give and also give something back. Things like early access to shows, bonus material, extended conversations, Q&As, some special offers, things like that. So there's a link in the show notes, patreon.com. There's also the option of donating directly via PayPal. There's also a link there. So to all of the people who have done that, thank you very much. I I really appreciate that. And then if you're not able to do that, simply going on the YouTube homepage, Universe Within Podcast homepage, and subscribing to the show, turning on the notification bell, and liking the video. It's a small thing, but it's a really big help. And then with the audio version, going on Apple Podcasts, leaving a starred rating and a review, and also subscribing to the show. So I think that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dennis. And it looks like we are recording. So great. Thank you so much, Dennis. It's a pleasure to finally meet. I've been doing this work for about a decade. And so, I think you're really one of the pioneers of this work. So I'd heard about you, I had heard about your brother, and then I came across you predominantly through my friend Carolina, who works, we used to work together at the Temple of the Way of Light, and now she works at Soltarda, and she does her own retreats. And then also one of my new friends, Luis Soledad. I met him, and he spoke really highly of you, and he was the one who I think really kind of kept pushing me to reach out to you. So I finally did.
Yes, that's right. That was the connection. Yeah, Luis is a great guy,
Mm-hmm.
and we hope to be working with him on a documentary project down there that we're ramping up, which we could talk about some of what that is if you want. But where would you like to take this conversation? And by the way, thank you for asking me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. Well, so a lot of people who follow this podcast, they've done a lot of plant work. I'm sure a lot are familiar with you, but maybe for anyone who isn't, I'm sure you've answered this question many times. But what's just kind of a really brief kind of story of who Dennis McKenna is and what got you interested in this work? Because I think as you get older, you're really now considered one of the pioneers, one of the visionaries of this work. So, how did that happen? Was this something that you were always interested in, or just kind of one thing led to something else, and you found yourself following this path?
Well, a little bit of both, actually. I, uh, uh, I didn't. Well, I mean, I guess everyone stumbles in a way. They stumble into what becomes their life's passion, and I'm no different in that sense. I have to say, my brother, who's also famous, and he was 4 years older than me, he's the one that led me down the primrose path in terms of our mutual interest in psychedelics. So, and that's really been the path that I've been following all my life, really, since I was a teenager. Not necessarily as a practitioner of shamanism or anything like that, but more as a person who, has benefited from. I feel I've learned a lot from my relationship with the psychedelics, especially, I mean, the two that are in at the top of my pantheon really are ayahuasca, which I did my doctoral work on in 1981 to 84, and that got me into it, and I've been kind of on that path ever since. And then the psilocybin mushrooms, the magic mushrooms, which I have been involved with even longer than ayahuasca in a certain way. And how did I get into it? Well, I was a child of the 60s. I was born in 1950. So my teenage years, adolescent years was 1960s, which was a turbulent decade for sure. maybe not quite as turbulent as the one we've been living through, but definitely it was a time of change. And my brother was studying on the West Coast. He went away 2 years before high school, before he finished high school, went to the West Coast and finished there, and left me stuck in Colorado in this small town, wanting to be on the West Coast where the action was, but not really able to do that. But we kept in close touch, and at the time, the countercultural movement was happening. People were interested in psychedelics, and Timothy Leary was at the height of his power and influence, and so on. So we were involved in that, in that countercultural movement. But the thing that was really, I think, a catalyst for both Terence and myself was DMT. DMT was a rare thing in those days. You didn't really encounter it much. It was more like the stuff of legend, and but Terence was pretty good at working the matrix, so he was able to find DMT, this extremely rare thing. And DMT, you've undoubtedly, well, you've experienced it in ayahuasca many times. I assume that you've probably taken it as a pure compound. It seemed like a order of magnitude more interesting, more strange, more alluring, if you will, than LSD. I mean, and LSD was pretty much what was out there at that time. I mean, there were occasionally you'd run into peyote or mescaline or things like that, but the psychedelic, era of that time was fueled on LSD. And yeah, we took LSD. We thought it was interesting, but then DMT came along, and it was like, oh boy, this is really interesting. And that kind of became a fixation for us. Was DMT. One of the things about DMT that is frustrating is unless you take it as an orally active preparation as an ayahuasca, it's very, very short. It only lasts 20 minutes or 25 minutes at most. Just enough time to be astonished, not enough time to bring a lot back with you, other than just this, sort of fading memory of something incredible just happened. And gee, I wish I could remember what it was, that kind of thing. So we were interested in finding an orally active preparation of DMT, because just on the naive assumption, if it's orally active, it would last longer and we could spend more time in that space and sort of get a better handle on what was going on. Because as you know, in intense DMT state, there's a lot going on. It's very chaotic. It's very circus-like in a certain way. We wanted to just be able to spend more time. The sense that one gets when you take DMT is there's a lot of information to be acquired, often offered by seemingly intelligent entities. And, they have something to tell you. They have a message, but there's barely time to begin to get the message before the experience is winding down. So we wanted to be able to prolong that experience. And in the late 60s, the importance of the ayahuasca admixture plants and the whole potentiation of the DMT containing admixture plants by the vine was not really understood. Ayahuasca was not that well studied. The admixture plants were not really, it was only until around that time that the importance of the admixture plants began to be recognized. So for us, we were not focused on ayahuasca. There was a paper that appeared in the Harvard Botanical Museum leaflets, which was called Varrola. as an orally active hallucinogen by Richard Schultes, the famous ethnobotanist. And we stumbled on that paper and we thought, aha, this is it. This is the perfect orally active form of DMT that, and we need to go get it. I mean, that was a basic idea. You know, our experiences had maybe led us into some kind of delusion, I don't know, but we had the idea that this was very important to understand this. And we were not approaching it from a spiritual angle or a traditional shamanic angle, really. Our perspective was, you know, both Terrence and me were, and I were, you know, we grew up steeped in science fiction, you know, and that was a lens through which we looked at this reality. And you know, this psychedelics came along and it was like, oh, you know, there are actually other dimensions out there and you can visit them. You know, these medicines will take you there. And that was kind of the lens through which we were exploring DMT and other psychedelics. So we actually thought this was a way to contact, you know, non-human intelligences. Whether they were extraterrestrial or not was not so clear. But that's what motivated us to go to South America in 1971 to look for this Witoto drug, which was called ukuhe in Witoto. And we went to La Chirera in the southern Colombian Amazon because La Chirera was the ancestral home of the Witoto people. So that's how we ended up going to La Chirera in search of this very obscure indigenous psychedelic. Well, then when we got to La Chirera, what was happening, I don't know if you've read my book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, because it's all in there. But when we got to La Chirera, we found that it's a little mission town. There'd been a lot of pasture cleared around the place, and they brought in these Cebu cattle, the humpbacked white Indian cattle. Well, and it was very warm and rainy there, all this pasture. So it was a perfect habitat for Psilocybe cubensis, the globally distributed pantropical psilocybin mushroom. At La Chirera in the spring of 1971, we were there, and the mushrooms, when we finally got to La Chirera, the mushrooms were in full flush, you might say. There were, you know, practically every cow pie in the pasture had a big, beautiful cluster of mushrooms growing out of it. So when we got there, we thought, oh, well, this is great. This will be fun to play with while we're waiting for the real secret, which we assume to be this ukuhe, to show up, because we'd been cautioned by an anthropologist that we'd encountered on the way in who was studying the Witoto. He said, you know, you can't just go into these villages and start talking about ukuhe. There will be a big reaction. You won't be, you know, it will not be positive. They don't, this is their, like, the core of their shamanic magic. And for, you know, you hippies to come there and start talking about ukuhe would not be diplomatic. So we thought, well, okay, that's fine. We'll go there. So when we got to La Chirera, we you know, we encountered these mushrooms, and we had very little experience with them before. I mean, almost none, you know, and I mean, we had encountered them on the way into La Chirera, but there were just a couple specimens, so we had a light experience with them. But when we got to La Chirera, they were everywhere. And we had a very sort of cavalier attitude towards it. We looked at that as recreation, that, you know, something we could experiment with and enjoy while we were waiting for the real secret to crop up, to connect with an informant about this ukuhe. Well, so we started eating mushrooms regularly, incorporated them into our diet essentially, because there wasn't a lot else to eat, and they quickly took over, and they made it clear that they were the real secret, you know, and that they had a lot of information to give to us, and so it kind of hijacked the purpose of our expedition in a certain way, because as the expedition had started out, it was basically this wacky ethnobotanical expedition. But when we actually got to La Chorrera and connected with the mushrooms, it started downloading all of this information about how we could effectively do an experiment, which has come to be known as the experiment at La Chorrera, which I won't go into the details of, or we'd never get past it. But anyway, that was what really changed my perspective about psychedelics, and where I guess the point at which I crossed the threshold from being a curious young man, quite interested in this stuff, but not necessarily, you know, committed to it, or not necessarily that deep in it at some point, because of the quest for the secret and all that, and DMT. I crossed the threshold from being mildly interested to being fanatic. And I guess in some ways that's continued, although it's been a many years since then. But one of the things I came away with from the experiment, from the trip to La Chorrera, was that I needed to go back and study pharmacology and botany and chemistry. And, you know, you would think it would be a little less, you know, that the experience would make me want to not study such hard science in a certain way, to study metaphysics or philosophy. Well, I was deeply immersed in metaphysics and philosophy before we went there, still still was at the time, but I was compelled to go back and study the actual plants and the medicines and how they worked. I have an orientation toward being a detail guy. I like to know how the machinery works. So 10 years later, I went back to Peru, this time to Peru as a graduate student at UBC at the University of British Columbia, where I was enrolled. And at that time, my focus was on ayahuasca, and I basically did my PhD on ayahuasca, and also on ukuhe, but not, it was a minor component of my study. So that's how I kind of became to be, you know, to do this professionally. Uh, and then, well, you know, I got my PhD eventually, and I did several postdocs, and ended up, you know, I ended up did postdoc at the Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology at NIMH, working on psychedelics, but not on ayahuasca. And well, that's how it's played out, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in the corporate world for a while. After I got after I did my third postdoc at Stanford, I worked for Shaman Pharmaceuticals for a while, which was a startup company. You can tell by the name, it was ethnobotany driven drug discovery. So I worked for them, and then different flirtations with the corporate world. Moved to Minnesota to take a job with Aveda, a cosmetics company, and I went looking for ingredients for them for a new line of cosmetics and supplements that they wanted to bring out from Brazilian plants. And at that time, I also did a biomedical study with a group of colleagues, which has come to be known as the Ayahuasca Project, which we done with the UDV, one of the syncretic Brazilian churches that uses ayahuasca. We initiated that study in 1993 and were able to get some funding for it. And out of that study, I think we got about 8 or 10 peer-reviewed papers, and so that actually, in some ways, that refocused the attention of a lot of researchers on ayahuasca, which had been barely investigated at all before that. There had been historically some investigations of its chemistry and so on, but that really sparked a big, fast increase in the rate of investigations of ayahuasca. I mean, if you go on PubMed, when I started that work, there was probably less than a dozen papers on ayahuasca in PubMed, which is this huge biomedical database. Well, now if you go on PubMed and search on ayahuasca, you'll get about 260 references will come up. So there's been a great deal of research done on it since. And so that's, I worked on, after I left Aveda, I realized I couldn't work for a corporation. I'm too anti-authoritarian to work for anybody. So I set myself up as an independent consultant to the nutraceutical industry, herbal medicine industry, and I did that for several years, managed to do okay with that, and then I ended up taking a job as assistant professor teaching ethnopharmacology and ethnobotany at the University of Minnesota in the what they called the Center for Spirituality and Healing, which is basically the alternative medicine program. So I taught those 2 subjects plus one in Hawaii on a regular basis called Plants and Human Affairs. And that went for a while. And then, I did that for almost, let's see, I started in, I think it was 2001, and I left the university in 2017. And shortly after that, we moved here to British Columbia, and my wife and I in 2019, and here we are. So
Yeah,
lately,
great.
what's that?
Oh yeah, no, yeah, keep going. That's great.
Yeah. So now what I'm mainly involved with on the professional level, I've founded a nonprofit organization called the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. And it's basically just continuing the teaching. It has a lot to do with plant medicines and psychedelics, but you can look at it here. I'll put the website up if I can. Wait a minute.
And what were some of those early, ayahuasca or yopo experiences like for you? What was it about that plant in particular that really drew you in?
Well, a number of things. My initial experiences when I was doing my graduate work in Pucallpa and Iquitos were not so strong, but strong enough for me to realize that it was an important medicine. There was a lot for me to learn from. And then when I was actually working on this UDV project, this biomedical study. I part of the study after we had that in order to prepare the study, the UDV had called a conference in Sao Paulo in 1991, and they invited all the researchers in the field to come there. And so we did a whole 3-4 days of PowerPoints and presentations and discussions, because they made clear what their research agenda was. They wanted to do a biomedical study so that they could show the regulatory authorities in Brazil, this agency called CONFIN, that ayahuasca was not a dangerous drug, that it wasn't a public health menace or anything. And they wanted to invite outside investigators to collect, to do this study. So they did this conference in 1991, and at the end of the conference, everyone went to one of their temples and took ayahuasca to wrap the conference up. There were about 500 people in this temple at that time when we had that. And I had probably one of my most profound initial experiences with ayahuasca in that situation, because I had a vision about photosynthesis, in which I participated on the molecular level. And I guess it's the kind of vision that only a plant biochemist can really appreciate, but it was very, very impactful for me, the realization of what an incredible miracle photosynthesis is and how it works and how it basically drives all life on Earth. It's the way that, the biosphere incorporates energy, solar energy from the cosmos, and uses it for, to support the proliferation of life on Earth. Anyway, so that always stuck with me, that experience. There have been others since. I just feel like, in the probably from the end of the 90s through the double aughts and up to the present day, I've done a lot of ayahuasca retreats, organized retreats. I just feel like ayahuasca has been a great teacher, basically, and I'm grateful to have the relationship with it that I do have. But also, the mushrooms, I don't want to disrespect the mushrooms. They have also been very important. And those two were kind of my major plant allies, if you want to put it that way. Of course, mushrooms are plants, but we'll overlook that. Yeah, so that's the situation.
Yeah, when I was talking with Luis, he said one thing you were really interested in was Gnosticism and a lot of these ancient mystery schools. Do you think the plant work has kind of intrigued you in that way of maybe seeing that some of this plant work or this ceremonial aspect was something that was really an integral part of these traditions like Gnosticism and the early mystery schools?
Yes, definitely. That's what the McKenna Academy is. I promoted as a 21st century mystery school, modeled after Eleusis in a certain way, because the plant medicines are central. They're teaching tools, essentially. Sometimes I say the McKenna Academy will be the first psychedelic university in 1,500 years, and not all the faculty will be human. But in terms of my own experience, some of my most satisfying experiences in my career have been when I've been teaching. And So since I left academia, I decided to go ahead and just start my own damn academy and continue that process. So that's what the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy is about. It's not solely exclusively focused on on psychedelics as such, but more like an open-ended curiosity about the mystery of being, I guess you could put it. Just the such an improbable place, what such an improbable situation that we find ourselves in, which, when you think about it, is pretty amazing. So the academy it's a vehicle for investigating those kinds of things, a platform for looking into that. And as you know, you have lots of experience with ayahuasca yourself, and you know that one of the big takeaways that people get from ayahuasca and other psychedelics too, but ayahuasca seems to be more special in this respect, is this profound understanding of our relationship with nature, and a perception that we are out of sync with nature. And that's where a lot of our problems are stemming from, the fact that we have gotten out of harmony with nature. And, the Western consciousness, the Western mind, in a certain sense, particularly the Western mind, has gotten poisoned by this notion that we own nature, that it exists just for us to exploit and dominate, and rather than nurture. And I think that we're seeing the consequences of that attitude as we basically set about destroying the planetary systems that keep things in balance. The atmospheric composition, the parameters of the ocean that keep it hospitable to life. All of these things. The biosphere is a huge equilibrium system, but its equilibrium is not infinite. You can push it out of balance, and if you don't push too far, it will reassert itself, and the planet has an incredible way of healing itself. But if you push it too far, then the systems become broken and they cannot reassert themselves. They can't reestablish that equilibrium. And we're right at the cusp where exactly that is happening. We're beginning to push some of these parameters to the point where they will not be able to recover. And ayahuasca and these other things are frantically sending us a message that, we basically have got to wake up, to what we're doing. And then we have to wise up. We have to, once we get awake to it and acknowledge what's going on, then the question is, what can be done and what can we do to try to mitigate this situation? How can we reestablish this? Excuse me. How can we reestablish this symbiotic partnership with nature that we've gotten away from? As we've gotten more and more estranged from nature, we've lost that. And, as a result, we are putting we're putting our own species, but the entire planet into peril, by continuing down the path that we're going down. So we have to wake up to what's happening, and then we have to wise up, and change things. And it's hard, but I do think that psychedelics are catalysts to this process. I think that I'm not somebody who says that, oh, if everyone just took psychedelics, everything would be fine. I don't think it's quite that simple, but I think that they're tools to help us learn what our right relationship to nature should be. You know, they can give us that insight. As a person who spends time at the Temple of the Way of Light, you see many people come there, and they come with their baggage or their intention or whatever it is that they're hoping to get by coming there. Many of them undergo transformations, many of them benefit, you know, and I'd say probably most people who come to that kind of situation, they get what they wanted, you know, at the deepest part of their spirit. And that's great. But the question is then, what do you do with that lesson? What do you do? You know, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, the real work begins after you go home from the retreat. You know, how do you change your life? How do you walk differently in the world and impact, you know, your presence in the world to hopefully shift it to be a positive influence, you know. Uh, so that's the thing. You know, from the psychedelics, you can get these insights and these new understandings of our relationship. But that's only half the problem, half the challenge. The other half is, once having gotten that, how do you change? You know, and I think that's something we all grapple with. And I'm not claiming that I've done it, you know. I mean, I'm still working on it. I think everybody's working on it. My feeling is with you know, with shamanism and these, any of these spiritual technologies, you know, a primary requirement is humility, you know, and a primary if you get to a point where you think you've got it all figured out, you don't have it figured out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm here to tell you, you don't have it figured out.
Yeah.
You have to completely, you know, you have to reach a point that's almost like being a newborn. You reach a point where you have to acknowledge, I really know nothing, you know, and when then learning can begin, you know. I mean, arrogance and assuming that we have it figured out, which for example, this is one of my criticisms of science, you know. Even though I am a scientist, I think that science can be very arrogant in certain ways, and as a result, blind to things that don't fit into its paradigm, don't fit into its current understanding of how it views the way things are, and so rejects it out of hand. That's not helpful, you know, because you know, you're essentially just dismissing a certain aspects of reality and experience that don't fit your preconceptions. And the whole point of science is that it's supposed to push against the unknown. It's a probe, it's a tool for examining what we do not know, you know. And in order to do that, you have to admit that there's a lot we don't know. Hence many other things to be learned.
Yeah, I think that's one of the beautiful things about plant work is it often really shows us, as you said, that there's potentially this other world, this other way of looking at things, and it really, I think, shifts people's perspective. And yeah, I think all of that you said is really important. That humility is, I think, so important, and gratitude. And you mentioned this idea of Ulysses, you know, these mystery schools. What do you think was happening in these mystery schools? And because it's something I'm fascinated in too, and it seems like it was an integral part of cultures all over the world. I mean,
I think not just what we would consider more indigenous cultures these days, but even at the root of the culture, for example, you and I come from this more European background of its basis in Greek schools, and probably even before that Egyptian schools. So what do you think was happening in these places like Ulysses? Because obviously this plant work potentially was an integral part of that, but it seems like something that's never really even discussed, even by kind of mainstream academics.
Well, you're right. Mainstream academics won't touch this with a 10-foot pole, because you're talking basically about heresies, under the doctrines of the church and so on. But that's changed. There's a remarkable new book that's just come out by this young classicist, Brian Murarescu. I think you
Rescue, I think. Yeah, The Immortality Key. I finished that.
The Immortality Key, and I've
Mhm.
been reading that book. I hope to do a podcast with him. I think, it reflects a lot of scholarship. He's really looked into this, and he's built on the original idea that Carl Ruck and Albert Hoffman and Wasson put forth in The Road to Eleusis, which was basically that the Eleusinian sacrament was some kind of an ergotized drink made from ergotized barley, and that all these pilgrims that would come to Eleusis, everyone who was anyone in Greek society would come at some point during their lives to have this experience, which was transformative, which they were forbidden to actually talk about, supposedly. And that was the kernel of the sort of the basis of the Greek religions, the religion of Demeter and Persephone. Well, you've read the book, right? But what Brian has done is showed that this is just one example of a whole tradition of sacramental use of these ergotized, or these not necessarily always ergotized, but these essentially spiked beers, that there was a fermentation culture that goes back possibly to Gobekli Tepe, 13,000 years. And in the modern instance, when you go to the Eucharist, the precursors of what we think about in the Eucharist in the first and second centuries AD, this was crazy stuff these people were doing. This was effectively, these ritual, these ritual sites were experimenting with all sorts of plant ingredients, not just one, but apparently multiple ones. So, and then all of that, and that was a period of great experimentation in the first and second centuries AD. But as Catholicism, Christianity became the state religion, they essentially abjured all that. That became like forbidden knowledge to talk about, and then they essentially just state-sponsored Christianity was kind of lost its spiritual punch, literally its spiritual punch, because the sacrament, the Eucharist, as presented officially in Christianity, is a pretty boring affair compared to what these people were actually consuming in these early Christian, or as Brian calls them, Paleo-Christian contexts. People were consuming these sacraments because they had an effect, because they did something for them. They actually did have, a revelation, which he claims, and I think there's some truth to this, that this, at least in Eleusis, this was regarded as a preparation for death. that you could die and be reborn, and people would come and they would have this psychedelically induced death rebirth experience, leaving with the understanding that death is not death. I mean, whether it was or not is not clear, but that was what they gained from these experiences. So then they had no reason to fear death. And when it became incorporated into Christianity, very much the same kind of things, the same kind of perceptions were applied. So um, I guess the hard thing for people that are, more when they take a more conventional view of history is to admit that, yes, in fact, psychedelics are probably at the very center of spirituality in the Western tradition, going back much further than Christianity, much older than Christianity. And when Christianity came along, these pagan practices were basically incorporated into Christianity. It was a continuation of that. It wasn't something that radically broke from what was going on before. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like such a fascinating thing because I mean these are common motifs all over the world. I mean even ayahuasca, it's a Quechua word that means vine of the dead or vine of the soul, and with iboga, which is another really old tradition, you classically you would have two ceremonies. The first is the death ceremony, and then the rebirth, and you see it in Vedic literature with that this knowledge came according to the Vedas from this mixture called soma, and in the Zoroastrian culture soma is hauma in the language. In Farsi they don't pronounce the s, they pronounce it like an h, so soma becomes hauma, and that's what Zoroaster took and also had revelation. And it's just in the Amazon, these plants are described the same way, and it's so fascinating, and it just seems like it would really reshape our view of not just history but the world we live in if we realize that at the essence of the cultures we come from is this kind of sacramental ritualistic work of really understanding what it is to die, and in that way what it means to truly live. And I think, like you said, understanding our place within nature, within the earth, within the cosmos, and trying to find that balance, which again seems to be one of the really common motifs of any religion or spirituality, is this idea of balance, of union, of harmony. So yeah, I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. It's I mean, I guess that people, who reject this notion, I mean, the evidence is there, and I think, people who reject it, it's basically a situation of, well, we don't want to attribute our uh, most cherished spiritual practices to, a bunch of people getting loaded on psychedelics, but in fact, that is what it comes down to. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in my view, there's nothing wrong with it. In the church, the church was invested they became invested in the idea that genuine personal spiritual experience was not for everybody. That the masses couldn't really handle that, and these practices with the early Eucharist, with Eleusis and so on, was kind of the opposite of that. That these experiences should be available to anyone. That almost as though it's a right to have these experiences, whereas the church became, very protective of the knowledge initially, and finally itself abandoned the knowledge, so that, or they so suppressed the knowledge that the Eucharist became essentially a hollowed out parody of itself, because it didn't really pack any punch at all. There was, which is one reason probably when during the Inquisition, uh, in the 1500s when the conquistadors found the mushroom cults in Mexico, the mycologists cults, and the mushroom in the Aztec word for the mushroom was Teonanacatl, the flesh of the gods, right? The Inquisition people were so incensed by this because they viewed it as blasphemy, you know, as a blasphemous parody of the Eucharist, you know. It's like, no, you know, we have the body of Christ. You can't claim this, but in fact, the traditional sacraments were much more impactful because they did have the mushrooms, you know, and the Christian Eucharist had a placebo essentially. So that's one reason why they suppress these cults particularly vigorously, you know, because it just can't be allowed, you know. We have the franchise on the flesh of God, you know, and they were well, anyway, even though those traditions were much older than Christianity, at least to 3000 BC and possibly much older. So, you know, I guess it's typical of spiritual traditions in a certain way, or spiritual practices, that there's a certain jealousy and tendency to, you know, promote your brand over everyone else's and say, you know, we have the truth. You know, those people over there, they're charlatans, you know, they're not genuine, you know. And the fact is, again, this comes back to, I think, the big lesson. One of the main things that I get from ayahuasca is that it always brings up the limitations on our knowledge, you know, and how it, I mean, either gently or sometimes not so gently, it always reminds me, just remember how little you know, there's no room for arrogance here. You have so much to learn, you know so little, so don't get on a high horse about it, you know. I mean, that's one of the things that ayahuasca, and of course that goes against the impulse of many spiritual traditions, because they're looking for a formula, they're looking for a set of doctrines or documents that embody the truth, like the Christian scriptures, for example. The truth is here. If you depart from it, then you're a heretic, you know. So free inquiry, especially of the experimental kind, is not encouraged. You know, only the priests get to have genuine spiritual experiences. And even that has been expunged from Christianity. I mean, the priests are not in the sacristy or something taking psychedelic beers together or psychedelic wines. Maybe some are, maybe some of the newer age ones, but as a rule, you know, the Eucharist is a symbol of something that may have existed at one point as an actual pharmacon, as Brian calls it. So, but now it's not. It's just a hollowed out symbol. And I think that this is one reason that there is such interest on the part of many people in these indigenous psychedelics, like ayahuasca, why people come to places like the Temple of the Way of Light or other retreat centers. In my experience, these are not people looking for kicks. These are not thrill seekers. These are people who are looking for something that is a genuinely personal, meaningful experience, you know, and they're finding that organized religions is just a hollowed out shell, you know. It cannot furnish that for most people, or for many people. They just find no spiritual resonance there. You know, these are like hollowed out traditions that don't even apply anymore. People don't relate to. So people want to have their own personal experiences. And I think that's why people seek out to experience things like ayahuasca in these more or less traditional uh, group contexts, you know. But then, having said that, of course, you know, the very phenomenon of ayahuasca tourism, of Westerners coming to Peru to drink ayahuasca, the impulse is genuine. People are looking for some spiritual satisfaction. But in the larger context, that also really impacts the sort of socioeconomic context of ayahuasca. I don't have to tell you, you've had lots of experience, but the ayahuasca tourism thing has really changed practices, you know, traditional practices, perhaps in better ways, in some ways, perhaps in worse ways. It's certainly introduced economic factors into it that were not there before. You know, so people say, well, you know, some people say ayahuasca tourism is terrible. It's destroying the traditions. It's depleting the resource. You know, and it's just a bad thing. I disagree with that. I think like anything else, there are negative and positive things about it. I mean, I think that people's desire to connect with something genuine on a spiritual level should not be denied. What the plants can do to help us reorient our perspectives on nature, that's a good thing. But then there are also problems with the spiritual tourism industry, if you want to put it that way. Temple of the Way of Light and others, I'm not singling them out for criticism. Actually, I think they're doing a pretty good job from what I've heard of. But one of the big issues that's right in front of everyone right now involved in this is you know, what are we doing to the resource? What are we doing to the sustainable sources of ayahuasca and the admixture plants? Because now that's a problem. You know, there's pressure on the plants. Ayahuasca is not quite an endangered species yet, but it may be soon. So in some sense, maybe it's good that COVID has slowed that down. You know, it gives us a chance to reorient and rethink this thing a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what with your school, the McKenna Academy, what are you looking to create with that? Is it kind of drawing on a lot of these traditions from around the world and trying to create a kind of a new system or a new path based on these traditions to really bring forth like a new way of learning or a new way of teaching?
Yeah, all of that. I mean, due to COVID, our program also has had to change in response to this. Originally, what we wanted to do was to do physical conferences and physical retreats, which we had been doing before COVID came along. And the idea basically was that the academy could be a place for natural philosophy, you know, not just focused on psychedelics, but focused on a broader understanding, a broader inquiry or study of us, our species, and our place in nature, and our relationship to nature, and anything else of interest that might come on the radar. Just a place, you know, a place where people can come I sometimes say it's not someplace you come to. We're not, we don't exist to tell you what to think. We help you learn how to think, and you can make your own mind up about these things. So the idea is to foster broad and uh, broadly based and overarching interest in natural philosophy, which is what science was before it became preoccupied with quantitation and reductionism. Because you know the sacrifice that science made is it's difficult for it to acknowledge there are other ways of knowing, that are just as valid but not scientific. So within the umbrella of the academy, we welcome both the science and the meta science, if you want to put it that way. And but because we have not been able to do physical retreats, we had been doing them in the Sacred Valley for well, since about 2012, but COVID put a stop to all that. So we've had to pivot and develop an online presence, which we're doing now. We're trying to do that while we wait around and see what's going to happen with the pandemic. Hopefully, we can start doing events in the Sacred Valley or other places later this year. We just, like you said, everything's up in the air.
Mhm.
We keep thinking it's going to be over, and then new things come up. So we'll see. We'll see. But in the meantime, we're doing these online things, and that's working out.
Ideally, if and when things open up, I mean, hopefully when rather than if, but what would that look like? I mean, if someone was interested in coming to the academy, what would someone's options be? How would that look like? Is it kind of like a long-term school where one would enroll for a number of years and take courses and go for workshops, or?
Yeah, all of those things. I mean, we're making it up as we go along.
Mhm.
Originally the focus was more on doing these retreat type events and doing conferences on different topics of interest, and we were thinking that a lot of that could happen in the Sacred Valley, although it can happen in other places too. And these are basically, a lot of these events would be places where you could take ayahuasca or other plant medicines. And we still want to do that. But right now, we're we're just focused on delivering the product via the web, delivering these educational opportunities through the website. And if you take a look, you can look at some of the past events we've done. Uh, uh, we did in April last year. We did uh, a several week series called A Tribute to Terrence, and in honor of my brother. He died 20 years ago last April. So this was a way to honor him and revisit some of the things that people were familiar with from our career. Basically, mostly it was conversations of me and people that Terrence knew, sort of fireside chat formats, which people really seem to resonate to. In the fall, we did a 3-day virtual conference on symbiosis, which turned out to be mostly about permaculture, as it turned out, just by the people that participated, and that was pretty successful. And then this year, we're trying to get a podcast series going, and possibly some other. We have a project that we're a long-term project that we're working on with my colleagues at UNEP in Iquitos, the Knowledge preservation project, in particular to work with a scientist there that I've worked with for over 40 years, Juan Ruiz. You may know him. He was the curator, well, he is the curator of the herbarium at the university. And have you ever visited him or run into him?
I haven't. I've heard the name. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess Juan Ruiz is a pretty common name, but he's an amazing guy. He's got one foot in science and one foot in traditional medicine, and he has incredible knowledge about the plants and how they're used and what they're used for. And you know, he's like a walking library, but he doesn't write any of it down. So part of what we're trying to do is document. We're trying to do a documentary series on Juan, uh, and what he knows and how he fits into, you know, the context of his local scene there, you know, and try and document what he knows while he is still around, you know. And I mean, he's not that much younger than I am, but then I'm not that young. So you know, time's running out for us. So one thing we want to do is do that. And then we actually have a longer ambition, a bigger ambition, which is to work with the herbarium there and turn it into a world-class resource for botanical, ethnobotanical researchers in the Amazon. And part of the long-term vision is to be able to digitize the herbarium, to scan all the specimens and put them up on the web, open access, link them to other scientific databases, and turn it into a tool where people can learn about these plants and their habitats, but also uh, uh, you know, in the process of creating this resource, you create a rationale to preserve the plants and the knowledge and the resource. So, you know, it, to try and create this as a learning platform for ethnobotanical researchers, or really anyone with an interest in the you know, in the Amazonian flora, for wherever they're coming from, whether it's ethnobotany or agroforestry or whatever, you know. So that's the idea of this knowledge preservation project. Um, and we're just in the earliest stages of this. In fact, Luis is probably going to help with this. Is he is around Iquitos now? I'm not sure. Are you in touch with him? He's
I am. Yeah. Yeah. He's working at a center there, and yeah, it sounds like things are opening up.
very good, very good.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what's he working at if all the centers are closed?
Well, the center, he went and he dieted. That was the first time he dieted plants, and he went to a particular center, and they were closed for most of the pandemic, but they reopened recently, and he's going back. I think kind of in a facilitation role, maybe doing a little production work for them, and just kind of getting his hands wet in a way, because I think it's work he would eventually like to do.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, very good. So I'm hoping to get down there sometime. We've got people who will be working on this project on the ground. Uh, One fellow, a graduate student at the University of Hawaii, I was on his committee, and he just finished his PhD working with Shipibo communities down around Pucallpa, and from the perspective of identifying what he calls cultural keystone species, of which ayahuasca is one, and how do these cultural keystone species fit into the preservation of traditional practices and that sort of thing. So he's there, and he'll play a big part in this, and we'll see where it goes. We need to raise a lot of funds to do this. We have some commitment for it, but it's going to be an expensive project. But we have, I guess you could say we have enough to do the initial filming and documentation that will then be used to leverage more support to do the next phase in the project.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I know we're coming close up on our time. One question I know a lot of people have is, I think one of the really interesting things you're doing is building upon these traditions, and as you said, these mystery schools, which are really rooted in these ancient traditions all around the world. One of the ways in which this work seems to be going forward is people may refer to it as like psychedelic assisted therapy, using the alkaloids and working in more of a clinical setting. What are your thoughts on that? And I mean, like you said, there's a good and a bad to everything. How do you see kind of that work moving forward versus at the same time guarding these traditions and all of the things that they really honor and really, it kind of created this process in the beginning?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I would like to see happen, and this is part of, this is a big part of the Academy's mission, is to bring this traditional knowledge and the scientific knowledge together in a way to create a new synthesis that takes, the best from both, and probably the, the psychedelically assisted therapies of the future will look a lot like shamanism, and they will look more like that than they will resemble a clinical setting with people in white coats and that sort of thing. And I think that this may be a way out of the conundrum, because as these plants are decriminalized, there is a movement toward decriminalization of most psychedelics in many communities in the States and also now around the world. The idea that these things should not be prohibited. They never should have been prohibited. I mean, the very idea is absurd that you would want to prohibit these things. People are waking up to that. And so what I think may be happening is that on the community level, as some of these cities pass these decriminalization resolutions and the plants become legal to use in that area, then in many communities there are existing psychedelic centers. It's just that they're underground. They have been operating under the radar for a long time. But if they can come out into the open and operate openly, then you can change the dynamic. So from people going to South America to find the medicine, find a retreat center, have these experiences, you can turn that around, bring the medicine to North America or Europe or wherever, and let it be administered through these centers and work with indigenous people to both produce the medicine and also help these centers learn how to administer it, but without the economic and other impacts on these fragile cultures in South America, to minimize that, to essentially, instead of taking people down there, bring the medicine to North America where people can experience it. That may mitigate some of the pressure on the plant resources. It will produce economic benefits for the indigenous people, but maybe in a more equitable way, and it will be a way that these things the benefits of these plants can be brought to the world, because the world clearly needs them, but while preserving the integrity and the cultural coherence of indigenous communities. So that's the idea. before it's always the the Western culture that impacts the indigenous cultures. Maybe this is a step toward turning that around, and we'll see if that's practical. But that's what I would like to see. I see that as a solution that's kind of midway between what you see now, which is you know the totally traditional use in South America or wherever of these things, and the clinical use. There's a place for both, of course, but I think there's a place for a middle, uh, some kind of model that takes from both sides and is basically a new paradigm, a new model. So that's what I would hope will happen in the next few years.
Yeah. Yeah, the last podcast I did, I interviewed a guy I work with. His name is Amika, and he comes from a group called the Tubu, who are in the Vopes region of the Colombian Amazon, in the Apapurus River region, and a really fascinating guy. And according to him, his people actually predicted the coming of the Spanish and the wiping out of this traditional knowledge. But also in their legends is, as he would put it, the creating of a new Maloka, where knowledge is brought from all four directions to create this kind of new earth in a way, or this new Maloka. And I find that very fascinating. Is that something you can foresee, where kind of this middle way of bridging these indigenous traditions with more modern culture, where this actually, in this spirit of a mystery school, where this once again becomes a kind of a part of people's lives, where there is this emphasis on natural science, and even this idea of true liberal arts, really learning all of these different arts, and in that kind of classic Greek way, of that Pythagorean way of really studying in depth all of these ways to really be a complete or whole human being, and this plant work being one of the real pillars in that, to create this harmony in earth.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You couldn't have I couldn't have said it better. That's exactly it. And hopefully these centers scattered around, they can be like their own kind of mystery school, but under the general rubric of and I think it will be a very different thing if these centers can operate out in the open. Then effectively every community could have a it doesn't have to be focused entirely on psychedelics, but it can be like a wellness center, or a retreat center, among which psychedelics are on the menu. Psychedelics are an option for people that want it. I think it could really go very far toward healing our not only individuals but our society, our communities. And you know, uh, all you have to do is look at the political situation now and realize how much we need that. I mean, everybody is at each other's throats, and it's really a pity. And it's disturbing that this is happening, and it seems to be accelerating so fast. I used to say that I still feel that psychedelics are one of the catalysts that can help us evolve beyond this stage, but I don't think it's the only one. I think and in itself it's not sufficient. We have a lot of evolving to do, and a lot of co-evolving to do, and that's what these plants have always been there for us. I mean, who knows why they make these alkaloids, for their own purposes. But the fact is, we find them useful because they make these alkaloids, and they make us have interesting thoughts, interesting experiences. So that's a symbiotic relationship. And hopefully we can learn enough so that we I mean, they've always been there. They've always been able to offer the lesson in a certain way. We haven't always been willing to hear it or listen to it or interiorize it. But maybe that's what's changing. I mean, that was, it's hard to do that when these things are all prohibited, but now the legal framework is changing. So I think that, as you say, I think that these should just be things, psychedelic experiences under well-controlled conditions, well-orchestrated set and settings, and so on, with practitioners that are compassionate and ethical, can be a tremendous force for changing the world in a better way. And we're overdue for that. We really need to wake up, and we need to wake up fast, because there's not a lot of time left. If you look at the rate of the way that basically the ecosystem on a planetary scale is it's not good. It's been disabled. I mean, it's not too late, but at a certain point, it will be too late. So hopefully we can get wise. These plant medicines may be a catalyst for that. So that's yeah.
Well, wonderful, Dennis. Is there anything you'd like to talk about that we didn't address?
No, I think we pretty well covered it.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time, and it's been a pleasure getting to meet you a little bit, and and also just to really acknowledge all of the work you've done throughout your life with plants and ethnopharmacology. And I think there's a beautiful quote. I think it was by Isaac Newton, who is a fascinating guy, because he really, for me, embodies kind of this balance between what we would consider kind of modern day science, but at the same time, he was an occultist. He was a guy coming from a mystery school, and that's actually where he said he got most of his knowledge from. And he has this quote, which is, if I've done anything great, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And I think people like you, really are those kind of pillars that allow people like myself and so many others to really do this work. And I think that's really one of the beautiful things about these plants too, is, it really, for me, and I think for so many people, as you said, it creates a humility and really a respect for everyone who's come before us and the traditions that have come before us. So, really just to say thank you for being you and all the work you've done. I think it's amazing. And I hope there's many more years where you can continue to do that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You're really too kind, but I'll take the compliment. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And let me know when you're posting so I can put it on the website somewhere, and stay in touch.
All right, everybody, that is it. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Dennis McKenna. It was really a pleasure for me to be able to talk to him, pick his brain a little bit, and have the chance to connect with him. So I hope you enjoyed that. As always, if you're able to help to support this show, that's a really big help. Patreon is a really good option. There's a link in the show notes, and you're able to subscribe. There's different tiers where you pay a different fee and you get something back in return for that. So it's a really nice setup, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&A, things like that. So to all the people who have done that, thank you very much. And if you're able to do that, I deeply appreciate it. There's also the ability of donating via PayPal, and there's a link in the show notes. And if you're not able to do that, simply going on the YouTube page, if you're listening via YouTube, subscribing to the channel, turning on the notification bell, and liking the video. May seem like a really small thing, but it's a really big help with the algorithms. And then on the audio version, going on Apple Podcasts, subscribing to the show, and leaving a starred rating and a review. So that's it for this episode. I'm not exactly sure the order of the next couple episodes, but I have some interesting guests coming on, an herbalist, some former colleagues of mine, but I'll sort out the order in the next week or so, and be back with another episode soon. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.